Hello there.
Go
Can you hear
ahead.
me?
Yes.
Awesome. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Hello, Crown Nelson. So you brought up the Public Finance Act 1989.
Yep.
Now, is that only to New Zealand? Because in Australia, we don't seem to have that act.
I've been looking at all your acts over there under the state and under the federal, the Commonwealth, and it's such a maze. It's unbelievable.
Yeah,
But I've
because I
set it
can't
up
find
on
it.
my laptop to be able to cross-reference between each state, just to get a glimpse of what's going on in Australia. And it's like each state is doing a different function of the banking system.
Yeah, because I think the banking system, the only thing I find here is under the Conveyancing Act in Australia, and if anybody else that is online, but there is nothing in regards to public finance. We have APRA that puts in the guidelines to finance, but there really isn't even a Crown Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme.
Yeah.
So I don't know how we can in Australia be able to use these laws, or is it because we are Crown or we come under the benevolence of Crown that we, using this legislation that you've put up on the screen, that it becomes part of our own legislation? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, just something that I'll put out there as a
you.
guest, and Crown can talk to this, is that being part of the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
We're part of the United Kingdom, and you wouldn't think there would be separate regulations for different parts of the United Kingdom. There can be things specific to your territory, but overall the same protocols would apply.
Well, they are the same protocols, but here is where, we're presented with some wonderful insights into our rights and our law and the financial, which inheritance, or however you want to speak to it. But then we come over to even in New South Wales legislation, which is where I am. There is nothing within that, even under the Conveyancing Act. And then we've got the Commonwealth law. So even in Commonwealth legislation, we can't find anything, well, I can't find anything within Australia that has that same public trust or public finance act. There is laws around the trustee and the roles of the trustee and the direction of a trustee, but nothing in terms of this kind of act, which is much more specific. So if anybody could help out in that.
Okay, sorry, I just noticed someone's drawn on the screen. So if you could answer that, Crown, please.
Or somebody else, or whoever, because obviously we're all learning.
Oh, there we go. Okay. There's a lot of legislation in Australia connected to New Zealand. And Australia is connected to New Zealand through the Trans Mutual Recognition Act. So if I put up, if I go into legislation here, Transtasman, Mutual Recognition Act. Now from New Zealand, it's linked to New South Wales. That's always been the joinder. And when we go into there, it's all about registration and occupation. That's the joinder. So a lot of this legislation in New Zealand is affecting you in Australia. You just don't know that.
Yeah, so what you're talking about again is back to the fact that New Zealand and New South Wales are joined.
Definitely. Definitely. So if I just put registration in there. Now, when talking about registration, your birth certificate's got a registration number on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
See all the references to registration. Registration. Now that registration goes all the way to the World Health Organization and the World Bank. Same registration. Meaning of registration. Here we go. In this act, registration means the admission, approval, certification, including and without limitation, the issue or practicing certificates, licensing, registration, or any other form of authorization of an individual required by or under law for carrying on an occupation. The registration, they're in occupation of that license, that lease, or that crown land through the registration. So the registration number on your birth certificate is your occupation. So when they ask you for your occupation, quote your registration number. Did that make sense?
Okay, I think people should maybe write that down. I haven't heard of that before.
They actually have a occupation tribunal when it comes to these matters. So we're talking about registration. You saw the registration of the name, the registered person. It's all about occupying, you know, that user right, occupying your land.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you won't find a lot of the stuff that I'm presenting here over there, because it's controlled from New Zealand. Okay. So you get the gist there. Okay, so just moving on, I'll just close that window. So here's the debtor, name of debtor. So any part of the name is reference to the debtor and appears on an official document such as a birth certificate, marriage certificate, certificate of New Zealand citizenship, passport, driver's license. That's all the name of the debtor. That's why they need the name, so they can create a tax invoice, credit and debit notes. Yeah? This is all to do with the name.
So in this legislation here, Crown, is it saying that it needs any one of those elements, or that it's saying this is a list of all the things you need?
It can be just one name.
So, for example, if I was talking to a policeman and he said, "What's your name?" and I said, "It's Crown Stephen," have I just given him an element of the name?
Well, there is a no name as well. So they want a name, whether it's Stephen, Nelson, but it's really about the name. If you look on all the forms you ever fill in.
Can I take you back to the question I asked?
Give them a no name.
If I said Crown Stephen, have I contracted in?
Yeah, through Stephen.
Okay, thank you.
Through Stephen. So it's the name that's condemning everyone to debt servitude, no matter what you call yourself. On all the forms, they require a name. When they pull you over the side of the road, they want a name. Okay? You see the debtor and the creditor. It's all about banking. This whole COVID, it's just a new banking system they're bringing in. And we can show you how they've updated under the Privacy Act, the 3 elements that they need to access your account. They've updated those positions to COVID positions. Okay. I'll show you that.
Okay, just before you go right into that, I'll take a couple of questions, because I think that might be relevant to where we're up to. If you could unmute yourself, please, Andy. Go ahead. You're not speaking, Andy.
Hear me now?
Yes, we can now.
Okay. I believe that between Australia and New Zealand, there's an agreement on all acts and statutes that are made. Would that be correct, Crown?
Yeah.
So anything anything that's written in New Zealand applies in Australia?
Yes, it does. Jurisdiction.
So it doesn't matter if we can't find it in the Australian jurisdiction, because New Zealand is part of New South Wales. Therefore, any New Zealand legislation that you're speaking about now can be used in Australia.
When they extended the jurisdiction of the court to New Zealand was a state of Australia, but it has been reversed. Now, through New South Wales, Australia is a state of New Zealand. They just reversed the roles. So it appears that way, but it's actually the other way around because of the time jurisdiction again. So everything to do with the name, you can see what's operating within the name. And we went through the copyright and there's no name. I've come across this no name quite a few times. I was out fishing and we're coming back in and there's this huge big launch and on the back of it, it says no name. What? This guy knows something. So I spent a bit of time going through legislation to find this no name. And it just happens to line up with what's on the RG9 where there is no name.
But
there's a no name.
Am I correct in thinking that any legislation that's written in Australia under the Trans Agreement between Australia and New Zealand can be used in Australian courts?
I believe you could use what's in New Zealand in an Australian courts. There are similar acts that are in New Zealand that are operating in Australia as well. You got the Crown Proceedings Act.
Okay, just in that area, Crown, let me ask a question. So if New Zealand is part of New South Wales, but now that's been repealed and it isn't, would that have taken a referendum to do that in accordance with the Constitution, or is there some instrument within the Constitution that allowed that to happen that was legal?
We're talking about the 1986.
Well, I'm familiar with what you said, but I'm not familiar with the legislation. But what I'm looking at is that if the Constitution is to be changed, because it's in the Constitution that New Zealand is part of New South Wales. So if that was to be changed, is that something that needs a referendum to change it?
No, it happened in 1839.
And so how did it take place? Because what I'm looking at is if it's in accordance with the Constitution or not.
Okay. Yeah, it's in accordance with the provisional constitution that was, okay. I'll take you to the papers passed.
Because the Constitution is a later date.
Huh?
But as I understand, the trans agreement between Australia and New Zealand is that all laws transfer from one to the other. So if you've got a driving licence in New Zealand, it can be used in Australia. If you've got a driving licence in Australia, it can be used in New Zealand. Everything transgresses between the two. Therefore, legislation must transgress between the two.
No, what I was alluding to is that events took place down in Wellington when the company, through the Port Nicholson deed of purchase, 27th of September 1839, was ratified in the Port Nicholson Gazette. And in that ratification, they extended the boundaries from that district to the territories to the colonies. That's where Hughes became a colony of New Zealand in 1839. And there was a provisional constitution gazetted in the same paper, and there was a proclamation made as well. That's when Australia became a colony of New Zealand.
So what I'm trying to ascertain is basically any legislation that you're talking about now would relate directly to anybody in Australia.
Yes.
Even if we can't find it in our own legislation.
Correct. If you look at the same time period when 1986, New Zealand cut themselves off from England, the Constitution Act, 1986. It's the same time frame as you guys. You followed.
Yeah.
That's the connection.
So did the Constitution, the Act to Constitute the Commonwealth of Australia 1901, did that change that relationship at all?
1900s.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
Well, that's the UK one, right? But remember, the 86 cut you off from the UK, England.
Yeah, but that's 86, but let's go back to times to say 1900, 1901.
Yeah.
So
Which is on,
hang on, Andy, I would like to hear what Crown's got to say about that.
Yeah, I had a look at that act, which is still in use in the UK legislation, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Which talks about Australia and New Zealand being part of that, yeah?
Yeah.
But in 1986, Geoffrey Palmer, they went to divorce themselves from the UK. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
Same as you guys. Followed suit.
yeah,
But they didn't have standing to do that.
we had 1986 Act, which didn't go through referendum 3 times, Council Act, which is the act in 1986 that nobody is, although it's been put in place, nobody agrees with that I speak to.
Well, maybe all this time that you followed didn't realise from 1839 you were part of New Zealand.
Yeah, well, yes, that's news to me. Yeah, I'd like to see that gazette of details. That would be very interesting. Thank you. You can send me that. I'd be very appreciative.
I could put it up right now.
Okay, that would be good.
That'd be wonderful.
It's on Papers Past. It's on Papers Past. Just for, so let's go to Papers Past. Okay. Where are we? I'll just pull this down here. Papers Past. This will shock you guys. You know, you think you've got all this and that, but in reality, it's all falsehood. Okay, Papers Past. Now, they reset and they set everything up from New Zealand through these events. So we're talking about by year, 1839. Here we go. Okay.